Good afternoon, everybody. It's a small, cozy room here. We have a few more online. So I really thank you for attending and either in person or remotely. I'll try to keep this to 1 hour as we scheduled, but I will stay around afterwards for questions anybody has. I'll make the presentation I am attempting to copy cover a very broad topic. So I'll probably move pretty quickly. But I do have a PowerPoint, and I'll make that available to anybody who wants it, or either now or later. And I can, as I said, I can stay after and answer any questions. But we do have a lot to cover, so I'm going to start. Let me just say a few words about myself. I do teach here at Empire, but I also practice immigration law and have for over 30 years. I started out in San Francisco a long time ago and worked there for 20 years, had a pretty broad clientele, but I had 0 clients who spoke Spanish. So it was kind of a crazy thing. My little niche was Polish and Russian clients because I speak Polish and Russian. And then I moved up here to beautiful Sonoma County about 15 years ago and had to, learn Spanish. And now 90% of my clients are Spanish speaking. So it's been a real joy and beauty in my life that towards the end of my career, I got to work for the wonderful Mexican culture that we live around and celebrate every day in the North Bay and Sonoma County in particular. I really consider it like one of the big blessings of my life. Anyway, I want to talk about the differences between the candidates in this election. We are 3 weeks away. There are big differences on a lot of things, as most of you know, and that's certainly true about immigration. So I want to try to, I am an immigration lawyer, as I mentioned, and I represent immigrants. We have a big team and thousands of clients here in Sonoma County and a few other offices. So I definitely have my biases. My job is to try to get people status in the United States. Some of them are doing family petitions. Some of them are victims of violence or domestic violence. Others are asylum applicants, people coming to the border that you hear all about. So I definitely have my points of view and my passions about this issue, but I'm going to try to present this in as nonpartisan a way as possible. I think it's fair to say, pretty obvious, frankly, that Donald Trump favors a more restrictionist set of policies with respect to both legal and illegal immigration, limiting entries for asylum seekers and permanent residents and visas. And one can expect that the Harris presidency, if it happens, will continue a more permissive approach that we've seen under the Biden administration. And I want to say at the beginning that it's completely legitimate to approach that fact by saying each has its own legitimate basis in a set of values. Whether I agree with it or not, it's totally defensible to argue that our government should have policies that more severely restrict asylum, permanent residence, even citizenship. So if you support a more restrictionist immigration policy, it's not necessarily racism or nativism. There are legitimate arguments for wanting that. So I'm going to present the reality of what we've seen in the Trump-Pence presidency, and then followed by the Biden-Harris administration, and simply try to report, what the differences were without making any value judgment. I leave that up to all of you and anybody else who is interested. By the way, if you want to refer people to this subject matter, I do write a column for the last 7 years in the Sonoma County Gazette, and I just published a piece this month on this subject. So the differences between the two candidates on immigration policy. So you can pick that up. It's online, of course, on the Sonoma County Gazette website. I'm publishing it in Spanish this weekend on La Sonoma Prensa, or Prensa, La Prensa Sonoma, excuse me. So you can look for that, refer it to your Spanish-speaking friends and relatives. So having said that, I'm going to approach this from a nonpartisan way. I want to say that it's very important for people, especially voters, to know what the differences are between the candidates. It's something I feel very passionate about. We need to know, if you're voting, and you care how the different candidates would treat our immigrant population, especially here in the North Bay, and what the implications are for that population, because they are huge. And I think the one thing that bothers me the most is not necessarily a pro or anti-immigrant, if you will, policy preference, but rather the people who think that there's no differences at all between the candidates, because nothing could be farther from the truth on immigration. All right, so I'm going to start with an overview. One can get a really good idea of what immigration policy would be like under Harris or Trump by looking at the policies the last 8 years. It's just obvious. And we've never had a situation like this where we have, you know, two candidates that have been in office recently, so we can assess how they handled immigration in the last 8 years and get a better sense for what they would do if they win the election. So let me start with Trump and Pence. So during his presidency, Donald Trump implemented a comprehensive agenda to reduce legal immigration, to deport undocumented immigrants already here, and dramatically limit asylum and refugee rights in this country. That was from day one to the last day in office, and it was pretty comprehensive. As a couple of you who work for me know, it dramatically altered the way we represented clients, the way we were able to help them or not help them. It was severe and comprehensive. That doesn't put a value judgment on it, as I said, but it cannot be denied that it was probably the most restrictionist presidency in my lifetime. Also, the tone and rhetoric of the Trump administration was all about protecting US-born Americans from those who would take their jobs or allegedly make our country less safe. And you're seeing that again this time around, obviously. Biden and Harris and their team spent 4 years working very diligently to reverse all of that. They undid much of the changes that the Trump-Pence administration did to asylum law and practice, both the substance of asylum law and the practice. They reversed some of the very restrictionist policies of Donald Trump toward family sponsorship and visas. Refugee admissions went way up. And I'm going to go into all of these. But they endeavored also to make DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, a more humane and welcoming agency, providing what they called service to what they called their customers, which are immigrants, as well as US citizens. Instead of what was a very clear brand under the Trump administration of, we only serve US citizens, and that was the purpose of the Department of Homeland Security, was to very much shape immigration policy to benefit only US citizens. So it's a difference in mentality as well as substance. The upshot is that while comprehensive immigration reform legislation was blocked the last 4 years by Congress, because it has to be through Congress. Any serious change in immigration law has to go through Congress, and that's a lot of misunderstandings in our community, in our society too. That why didn't Biden do this? Why didn't Obama do immigration reform? They don't have the power to do that. You need a majority of both houses of Congress, and with the Senate, you need more than a majority. You need 60 votes to overcome the filibuster. So that is what has frustrated all the efforts of people who wanted immigration reform to make it happen. Although they have not been able to bring about comprehensive immigration reform, the Biden administration have effected reform through regulation, through executive order, and administrative policy. And it's fair to say that in my lifetime, we've not seen a more, what I would call, a pro-immigrant administration, certainly permissive immigration administration. So we can expect a new Trump-Vance administration to continue and escalate those policies that the Trump-Pence administration had. Donald Trump has promised widespread deportation of undocumented immigrants. The numbers he has mentioned, deporting 15 to 20 million immigrants. That's what he told Time Magazine in May. That would mean that every single immigrant, undocumented immigrant here, and some that without status and some with status, would have to be removed. It's never going to happen, but just the threat of that is pretty ominous. Trump also said that he will cut back or eliminate programs that have provided for legal immigration. The rhetoric about the Haitian refugees or Haitian immigrants, because they are immigrants, they're legal immigrants coming on a legal program, that has been reflecting a bias in the Trump administration and a plan that they have to cut way back on legal immigration as well as illegal immigration. They can call these people illegal immigrants, but they're not. They're legal immigrants. So that is an example of what we're likely to see and which we saw under Trump-Pence, which is a drastic cut in immigration, legal immigration in this country. We would also expect some other significant changes. We would expect that, especially if the Republicans have control of both houses of Congress, they would try to get legislation passed, which they didn't do the first 4 years. They would probably try to restructure asylum law and cut the annual limits of legal immigrants, which would lengthen even further the amount of time that immigrants have to wait when they're being sponsored by a family member. By the way, if you're Mexican, if you're a Mexican citizen and you are sponsored by your sibling or your parent, which is one of the very few common categories, you will wait 24 years for your green card. So that means if you apply today, you know, you can expect to get your green card, all things being equal, in 2048. That's one of those are how bad the waiting periods already are. Now, if we see a cutting of the very small quotas that already exist for family sponsorship, we're going to see even longer waits. As far as Kamala Harris, you know, she has basically spoken out that she's going to try to change the way we deal with the border. She's expressed her support for the legislation, the bipartisan legislation that was negotiated through Congress but did not get through, in large part because of Donald Trump's opposition. That's a very, let's call it an anti-asylum, anti-immigrant bill that has a lot of restrictions on who can apply for asylum, when, how, where, and it was negotiated by one of the most conservative members of the Senate, Senator Langsford from Oklahoma. So if there is a will in Congress to pass that, Kamala Harris has said she will sign it. However, otherwise, she's also tried to tie that support to immigration reform and her goal, let's call it a goal, of trying to push through immigration reform through the Congress, whatever that ends up looking like after the election, including a pathway to status, long-term status for DACA recipients. Okay, so let's talk about specifics. Deportation policy. Okay, that's obviously a very important topic, a very timely one. We're hearing a lot about deportation. Well, the Trump era, beginning in 2017, changed dramatically our deportation policies that pre-existed that. So the Obama administration had a policy of focusing on criminals, and primarily, especially in the last 4 years of his term. Things were a little different the first term, but the second term, he adopted various policies of what they call prosecutorial discretion, which would be meaning we're not going to deport all undocumented immigrants. We're going to focus on those who have committed crimes or violated the law in some significant way. And we're going to recognize people who are here for 20, 25, 30 years, have families, have kids, have homes, that are obeying our laws and have obeyed our laws. should not necessarily be deported, especially when we're favoring immigration reform in the first place. So Trump changed all that, and it suddenly became a badge of honor at ICE, at Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that the agency would deport anybody. So even those with clean records and children born in the US, now they didn't necessarily deport millions and millions of people because they never spent the money to round them up, despite many threats to do so. But what did happen is they grabbed the low-hanging fruit. So anybody who would cross immigration's path one way or the other, whether they were somebody who committed a crime or they were just law-abiding citizens who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, they would get deported. And we saw this in our office time and time again. They would be, I should say, they would be put into deportation proceedings. Thankfully, we with good legal advocacy, you can usually stop a deportation for years and years and years, if not forever. But they were put in deportation proceedings, which also, as you can imagine, causes enormous trauma for a family and for an immigrant. So they were non-discriminatory about that. They deport anybody, you know. So that was a major change. They also promoted policies penalizing cities and counties and states that refused to turn over undocumented immigrants to ICE for arrest and deportation, the so-called sanctuary policies. Now, I want to say a few words about that from my personal perspective. You know, we hear a lot about sanctuary cities, and it conjures up a total wrong image of, the mayor of Santa Rosa hiding people in their basement. That's not what sanctuary city is, and that's not what sanctuary state is. What our sanctuary laws did, and there were a series of them in California, for example, in 2000, starting in 2012, 2014, and then finally the Obama administration passed their own kind of, let's call it, sanctuary type policies. What that did is change what was happening before that. When I moved up to Sonoma County in the North Bay, we practiced in Napa County, Solano County, Marin County, Humboldt County, Mendocino County. All those counties were being devastated by deportations. So anybody who was undocumented, if they were pulled over for driving without a license, because they couldn't get a license back then. If you were pulled over for driving without a license, you were turned over to ICE to be put into deportation proceedings. And we had hundreds of clients in that situation in the North Bay that did nothing more than drive their kids to school or drive to work and were pulled over because they couldn't get a license. That was going on up here in 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011. I can tell you from personal experience. And we represented hundreds of those people. That started to stop in 2012 due to our sanctuary laws. So when people talk about California sanctuary laws, that's what they're talking about. The policy that California put in place statewide to say, no, we're not going to take somebody who's otherwise law-abiding, and just because they drove without a license or maybe their lights weren't working, we're going to turn them over to ICE for deportation. That's what our sanctuary laws are, in case anybody ever asks you. So the Trump administration tried to go after those laws and had some support, Orange County, other parts of California that actually sued to stop our sanctuary laws. Fortunately, that never really happened, and those laws are still in place. But the Biden administration, reversed much of this deportation policy. And what they said is, we're going back to what the Obama administration did. They implemented some prosecutorial discretion rules, which allowed lawyers like us to go in and take somebody who was put into deportation proceeding under those earlier eras and under the Trump era and close their case, get them out of deportation proceedings. Didn't get them a green card, but at least it allowed them to continue to live here with their family. Some of them have been here decades. And that policy was a huge benefit for thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. There have been hundreds of thousands of those cases closed nationwide. So that's totally under the radar. Media never covers that. But that's one way that the Biden administration made a big impact on counties like Sonoma County. Um, Also, what the Biden-Harris administration did was say, we're going to continue to deport the heinous criminals, and they have. So people who have serious violent felonies are still being deported. Now, Donald Trump is promising basically a return to mass deportations. Again, we don't know if this would actually be carried out if he becomes president, but has said multiple times that he's going to deport between 15 and 20 million people. I mean, that would be insane. First of all, that they estimate there's only about 11 to 12 million people here that are undocumented. But even if it was a significant portion of that 11 to 12 million people, it would totally disrupt our hospitality industry, many other industries up here and across the country, agriculture. So apart from the economic effects, this sheer number of families that would be disrupted. We have right now, I think there's around 800,000 people in deportation proceedings right now at any given time. I can't vouch for that exact number, but it's certainly less than a couple million. So if you take, and it still takes like 5 to 10 years to get through the system. So you can imagine what would happen if you took even 2-3 million people and put them into deportation proceedings. It would be outrageous from an administrative point of view. Okay, let's see. I want to move on and talk about DACA. It's another important topic for our county. I checked it out, and according to the Department of Homeland Security, Sonoma County itself has 2,150 people living here with DACA. So that's current people with DACA. There's also been many, many others that have got DACA, benefited from it, moved on. That's pretty true of all the North Bay counties. You're looking, I would say the whole Bay Area is probably approaching 100,000 people with DACA, or at least California, 100,000 people. They say that there's currently 500,000 who currently have DACA. So what did the Trump-Pence people do to DACA? Well, early in his term, Donald Trump tried to close down DACA completely. For those of you who don't know, DACA is an Obama-era program that was implemented by executive order. It allows work permits and a reprieve from deportation for people who've been here since they were children. So they had to come before their 16th birthday. They had to come before 2007. So that, at this point, that's 18 years ago, right? So 17. So these are people who have long-term presence in the United States, but they had to have gotten a high school education or the equivalent thereof. So they couldn't have committed any crimes. So those are still the requirements of DACA. You can't get DACA if you're a felon. And you can't get DACA if you came here as an adult. So it's a very limited program. But Donald Trump tried to close down DACA. He was stopped from doing so by a couple of different federal judges. And so DACA did continue for those who currently had it, but he did manage to close down DACA for new applicants. So since 2017, anybody who became eligible for DACA could not get it. And I want to talk about that in a little bit. He also took away DACA recipients' right to travel, which we call advanced parole and business. This is not only important because it stopped people from being able to visit their parents or grandparents abroad, but also, more importantly, that was an avenue and was a big avenue for a lot of these people getting green cards and ultimately citizenship who had DACA. Because if you left the country with a permit, you came back in and you married a US citizen, you could get a green card here. And that road was closed by the Trump people. So those were two major things. Stopped DACA for new applicants and closed the pathway to a green card by taking away the right to travel. The Biden-Harris administration immediately upon taking office tried to undo those two things. So very importantly, they restored the right to travel and the path to a green card. So for the last 4 years, we've been able to get people with DACA, green cards if they marry a US citizen. Now we're getting to the age where some of them have children that are 21 years old, born in this country, and we're getting some of them green cards. So that pathway was restored, and that's been wonderful. The other thing, though, that the Biden administration tried to do from day one was reopen DACA to new applicants, which had been closed for 4 years. That was blocked by a federal judge in Texas. So this is another fact that's been ignored by the media. No one pays any attention to it. It drives us crazy. But DACA has not, we consider DACA a youth program, right? But the reality is it's no longer a youth program because anybody between the ages of 15 and 23 cannot get DACA. Why? Because in 2017, the Trump administration closed DACA to new applicants, and you couldn't apply before you were 15. So that means any kid who turned 15 after 2017 could not get DACA and still cannot get DACA. So that's 8 years. So basically, anybody between the ages of 15 and 22 do not have DACA, even if they would otherwise be eligible. So you're talking about, the estimates are several 100,000 people, maybe even 500,000, that can't get DACA because of this Trump administration policy, and then the federal judge in Texas who single-handedly blocked the Biden reopening of DACA for the entire country for the last 3.5 years. So that's, again, something nobody pays any attention to in the media. And fortunately, the case is finally moving forward to the appeals court. There was an argument last week. I'm going to write a piece about it in the next month's Gazette about what is going to happen from this point. It's in the appeals court. We're not optimistic about success there, but ultimately it'll go to the Supreme Court, and there's a chance that the Supreme Court will support the DACA program and reinstate the possibility for all these hundreds of thousands of young people to apply for DACA. All right, let me talk about visa benefits and citizenship, right? Because in the media, all you hear about is the border, the border, the border, and we don't really learn about what the Trump-Pence administration did, what the Biden administration did on visa eligibility, which affects our population much, much more than the border in terms of like the hundreds of thousands or millions of people undocumented in this country who sometimes are eligible for a visa through a spouse, a US citizen spouse, for example. If they get married to a US citizen spouse, or they have a parent or sibling who's a US citizen that sponsors them, the waits are very long, but the way our government handles and processes those applications have extremely important implications for the millions and millions of immigrants waiting for status here in this country. And that includes many, many people in this county and in the North Bay. So I like, when I talk about this subject, to address that issue because nobody else does in the media. So the Trump-Pence administration enacted a panoply of restrictive immigration policies, limiting family petitions and kind of sanctioning these arbitrary denials, closing some of those pathways to residency and citizenship. We saw this in our office, so 1,000 little rules. It would take me too long to describe them all, but I want to give you one example, okay? The Trump administration, maybe some of you remember this, tried to enact what they called a form of public charge regulations. So they, with great fanfare, they said, oh, we're going to just enact these public charge regulations to make sure that anybody applying for a green card has somebody who can support them financially. That's the way it was sold to the public. That's the way the media covered it. In reality, that already existed for the last 40 years. Ever since I became a lawyer, there's always been those rules. What changed was up until 2017, the rule was there are financial guidelines in place. So in other words, to prove that you're not going to be a public charge to the United States of America, you have to have a sponsor, usually your spouse or father, brother, a relative who's sponsoring you, or it can be a different person, but somebody who signs under oath, who's a US citizen saying, I will support this person and I make enough money to do that. They have to present their taxes. That's always been the law. And if you don't do that, you don't get a green card. Now, what the Trump people try to do is say, we're not only going to keep that in place, but we're now going to add a level of discretion to the consular officials, and they can decide in their own judgment whether somebody they think might become a public charge, even if they meet those financial guidelines. So what does that mean in reality? That means that the clients that we and other lawyers represented, who went through years and years of process, waiting for their interview in, let's say, Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, where the US consulate processes all Mexicans applying for a green card, they could go down there after 20, 30 years in the United States, hoping for the green card, and have a bureaucrat who works for the State Department say, you know what, I just think there's too much risk you'll be a public charge, so I'm denying your case, you're stuck in Mexico forever, sorry. Obviously, that would have been devastating to the hopes of all these people who are in the process of trying to get a green card, and probably would have precluded most of them from even going down there because the risk would be too high. Some officer would say no and they'd be stuck. That was the big problem with that public charge law. It wasn't that the idea itself that somebody should be able to prove they can support themselves. That already existed for 40 years. So fortunately, federal judges blocked that law and it never took effect. But that was an example of the way the Trump administration tried to inject a certain arbitrariness and unpredictability to family sponsorship that would have really devastated a lot of immigrants' hopes of getting status. The Biden administration has done a few things on citizenship and visa eligibility. They recently tried to start a parole program. This was just the summer. Maybe some of you read about it. It was supposed to take effect on August 19th. It would have been a program that said, you know, there's a 6-year program for you to get a green card. It takes 6 years if you marry a US citizen. We'll now allow you to do it in 1 year. And instead of making that trip all the way back to Mexico or whatever country you come from to get your green card overseas that is required under our laws currently, we're going to make an exception and let you do that here. So it didn't increase the eligibility. The same people are still eligible for a green card, but we're going to just make it a little bit more humane, let them do it here without that long, risky and scary trip outside the country. And instead of 6 years of waiting, we're going to do it in 1. That program was blocked within 3 days in August. Again, media, nobody's paying attention to it. This would have helped hundreds of thousands of immigrants, to make their life easier. And the Republican governors who opposed Biden, within days of the law taking effect, filed suit. They found a Trump appointee judge in Texas who blocked the law nationwide. It's still blocked. And I don't have much hope that it won't be unblocked for a while. But there's an example of how the Biden administration tried to alter our very long and difficult processes for visa sponsorship through family members in a way that would have really made a difference in people's lives, but was blocked. What the Biden administration has done, the Biden-Harris administration, is they greatly reduced the processing time for a lot of these applications where there's eligibility already. So for example, for citizenship, it used to take 1.5 years. Now it takes 4 to 6 months. Adjustment of status in the United States, if you have a US citizen spouse and you're eligible to apply within the US, so instead of that 6-year time period, it can be done now in 6 to 8 months if you're eligible to do it here. Most people are not, but so little things like that have actually increased the efficiency of the visa processing for family sponsorship. I want to move on to talk about relief to victims of crimes and domestic violence. So the Trump-Pence administration did not make any major changes in that, but they did allow the waiting period for U visas to grow. So there's something called a U visa. Let me start with that. that's a visa for victims of domestic violence or victims of other crimes. So you have to be a victim in the United States, not abroad, in the United States. So if you are a victim here and you report the crime, you cooperate with the police, you provide information to them in the prosecution of that crime, and the crime is a serious crime, it's got to be a violent crime essentially, you can qualify for a temporary visa called a U visa. And the idea is that you want undocumented people to come forward and report their crimes. Otherwise, people would be too afraid that they'd be deported. So that's the purpose of the U visa. It's been part of our Violence Against Women Act. It was passed as part of the Violence Against Women Act, I think 25 years ago. So it's been in place a long time, but it used to be, so there's a 10,000 limit for the entire country of U visas, which used to be sufficient. Now it doesn't come close. So the waiting period under the Trump administration grew from several years to now 8, some people estimate 10 years before you'd actually get your visa. That's statutory, so the Biden administration hasn't been able to affect any change in that because it's a statutory quota, it has to pass Congress if you want to change that quota. But what the Biden administration has done that's been sensational for the families that we represent that are waiting, and we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of families, is that they have allowed people to get a work permit while they're waiting. So it's kind of like a form of legal status. They get a work permit, changes their life. Hundreds of thousands of people have been able to do that. Again, totally under the radar. Nobody's covered it in the media. So that's another life-changing thing that's happened the last 4 years. Let's talk about visa policies towards Muslims and persons from developing countries. Well, the Trump-Pence administration slashed the number of refugees under our system. We used to provide for anywhere between 100 to 200,000 positions per year, or let's say spots per year for refugees. People not at the border, but people coming from Sudan or Syria or places in the world that are ravaged by war or other difficult conditions, seriously difficult conditions, Afghanistan. That's how these people come here. They come through refugee status. Well, that was slashed by the Trump administration to something like 20,000. I think in 1 year, less than 10,000 came because they made it, not only did they reduce the limit, but they also made it much, much more onerous to actually qualify and much a longer process. So whether you agree with it or not, that was a significant change for a lot of families coming from war-torn countries. That has been reversed by Biden-Harris. Now I think we're allowing it a little over 100,000 as we did under Obama. Also, the Muslim ban. Donald Trump famously referred to certain countries as shithole countries, and his policies towards visas policy reflected that mentality. And so we have he tried to implement a Muslim ban, basically banning people from many countries that are majority Muslim. And that was ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court. That has been reversed under Biden-Harris. And we've seen just a generally more egalitarian policy with respect to visas from other parts of the world that are developing. Okay, asylum policy. Obviously, this is a big one and something that gets a lot of attention in the media, but not with much substance. It's all on the surface. Oh, these people are coming in. We have this catch and release system. That's what they call it. But nobody really knows how it works or what the numbers are or where these people go. It's a very day-to-day thing for us because we represent thousands of these people. I've had 5,000 asylum cases. So I'm very familiar with the law, both in the days when I worked in San Francisco and up here. So I can speak to, and I will, about the changes we've seen. The Trump-Pence administration really didn't like asylum. They went after asylum in every conceivable way, both in terms of making asylum seekers wait outside the United States if they were at the southern border famously separating families who applied for asylum, taking children from their parents, to discourage them from seeking asylum. But they also, under the radar again, issued these onerous executive orders, which dramatically changed the substantive law of asylum. So for people who did have those cases in court or applications for asylum pending in the asylum office, suddenly all the rules changed. And what am I talking about here? Well, it used to be that if you were a victim of serious domestic violence in your home country, let's say, for example, some Central American country, and you could prove that, you could prove that if you go back, you'll be harmed by potentially your abuser, and that the government tolerated that and refused to enforce domestic violence laws in their country. If we proved all that, you could get asylum. Not under Trump-Pence. They issued an executive order saying domestic violence cannot be a basis for asylum anymore. Same thing with extortion and other forms of threats from gang violence. Used to be a basis for asylum. Under Trump-Pence, they passed an executive order. By the stroke of a pen, we're suddenly changing decades of case law and saying you can no longer make an argument that you'd be a victim of cartel violence and be eligible for asylum. So there were these dramatic changes in substantive asylum law. Again, totally under the radar. No one talked about it. Well, Biden-Harris reversed all that, reversed all of it. All the executive orders were nullified. The policy of remain in Mexico was nullified, was reversed, and of course, the separation of families had already been shelved by the Trump administration after it came under great attack for that. I want to say a few quick words about the remain in Mexico policy. That sounds a lot better than it is. So it came up in yesterday's interview of Kamala Harris. The thing is, it sounds like a reasonable idea. Let's just let people stay in Mexico until their asylum hearing comes, and then we'll let them in, so they're not waiting in the United States. Well, the reality is, we know because we see it, is these people are in they're not even refugee camps. They're camped in unsanitary, dangerous places run by cartels at the border. And so the policy of this remain in Mexico really was, we're going to give you a number and go away and stay in Mexico, and then sometime when we summon you, you have to come and go to court and try to present your case for asylum, even though you haven't been able to see a lawyer or talk to your lawyer because you're in Mexico and you're in a dilapidated refugee camp. So naturally, none of these people were able to actually really pursue asylum claims. And it wasn't just a procedural thing, it ended up being a substantive thing. You're really cutting off asylum. These people by forcing them to stay in some place that's not their home, where there's absolutely horrid conditions and dangerous conditions. And so naturally, it caused a lot of people to just give up and go home, and so effectively shut off asylum as a remedy. So it was billed as this reasonable policy of just let them wait in Mexico, but in reality, it removed that option for thousands and thousands of people. That's why the Biden-Harris people undid it. Obviously, the Trump administration Trump campaign is promising to bring that back. One other thing that the Biden-Harris people have done that we see all the time is they enacted a more sane system for processing people at the border. Not everybody does it, but they created an app, and it does work. So if you're a refugee from Venezuela, for example, or Colombia or Mexico, you can go on an app and make an appointment. And what it did is it controlled the number of people who could apply for asylum in a legal way. So they would have an appointment at the border. They still do it. So they still have appointments at the border, and they know when their case is going to be heard at the border or considered. And then when they get to the border, they are interviewed to determine whether they have a reasonable fear of harm, and if they do, they're allowed to come in and pursue. They still have to pursue their case through the court. So these people who are coming in either through the app or through the border and seeking asylum at the border when they try to enter illegally, it's a fallacy that many people think they're just coming in, pouring in, and disappearing. No, they're put in deportation proceedings. So they have to prove in front of a federal judge that they have a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, or social group, or political opinion, one of those 5 factors. And if they don't prove that well-founded fear of persecution, they're denied and deported. So those people now can do that through an appointment rather than trying to come illegally through the border. That's been one of the ways in which in this year the number of people crossing the border illegally has gone way down. One last thing about the numbers at the border, because it obviously gets a lot of attention, including yesterday at the interview. The numbers that are reported, these millions of people, those are the numbers of people that were caught. So I was looking at the numbers before preparing for this interview and for this presentation. And the thing is that the numbers are high. There were several million last year, but the thing is, those are the people that we caught. So just looking at it as, oh, our border's porous because 2 million people got caught. Well, actually, those are people who were caught. So in 2000, when Bush was president, Bush and Clinton, 2000, 2001, approximately 1 million people were caught. And I can tell you, because our borders were a lot porous and I practiced back then, a lot more people got in and weren't caught. So there's a lot of fallacies about the numbers that are thrown out there in the media. And just remember, when you see those numbers, these are the people we caught, not the people who got in without getting caught. That's one thing. And the second thing is they catch most of the people now. We know that. They catch the overwhelming number of people trying to come in illegally. Now, what the Trump people don't like is that many of them then seek asylum, and they have that process in front of a judge that I mentioned. But they don't like that fact that they can seek asylum now. But in 2000, we had, in my opinion, probably bigger numbers coming in, but many of them were not caught. And we know that from our clients, because many of them who came in the 2000s and even the decade after got in without being caught. So I just want to flag it for you that when you see these numbers thrown around in the media, understand that it's a little deceptive, and there's more to it than what is portrayed in the media. Okay, bottom line, and I'm coming back to kind of where I started, is the choice in this presidential election is very stark, and no more so than with respect to immigration policy. So under Trump's term, we had a comprehensive, kind of well-coordinated, carefully executed restrictionist policy. Whether you agree with it or not, and there are justifications for some of it, that permeated every aspect of immigration law and policy during his term. And Donald Trump promises to go even further in this regard and deport huge numbers of undocumented immigrants. Biden-Harris, as I mentioned, has been the most, let's say, pro-immigrant administration in my lifetime, certainly making immigration law and policy less restrictive across the board. And based on her policy statements, one should expect Kamala Harris to take even more specific measures in that regard, while trying to limit the number of people seeking asylum at the border, because obviously there's a big drive for that in our public opinion. So, as I like to say, su voto es su voz, right? Your vote is your voice, your opportunity to make your views known. Please tell that to your friends, relatives, anybody who can vote. You have to be a citizen to vote, of course. But if you care about immigrants living here as our neighbors, if you're concerned about how our government treats them, if you want our immigration policy to be reformed, then make your views known with your vote. It's never been more important than it is this November 5th.
I want to thank everyone for attending this evening and the professor for a wonderful presentation and our guests and their wonderful questions. And again, after some editing, we'll be posting this to the Monterey College of Law YouTube page so you can go back and review it and share it with others who you think might be interested in seeing it.